On the morning of December 16th, 1944, a cold silence hung over the Ardennes. Snow lay in patches between dark pines, and a gray sky pressed low to the ground. In Berlin, Hitler signed the final order for a gamble so large it could only be described as desperate. A surprise offensive through the Ardennes to split the Allied lines, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. He believed the Americans were brittle, that winter and surprise would break them. He was wrong. The German plan depended on speed and shock. For weeks prior, German units crept into forested assembly areas masked by radio silence and pretense. They moved tanks, half-tracks, and columns of troops under cover of darkness. The Ardennes was thinly held. The Americans had considered it quiet sector, a place to rest and refit. The Germans chose it for that reason. At dawn, columns that had seemed like shadow and rumor became steel and movement. Artillery spoke. Infantry surged forward. Whole divisions collapsed into motion. The first days were chaos for the Allies. Communications were clipped, command chains strained, and the weather intervened. Low clouds and snow grounded Allied air support. That loss of air superiority was critical. For months, the Allied air forces had dominated the battlefield. Planes resupplied, harried, and destroyed German columns. Now the sky closed. Tanks and men moved with fewer eyes watching them from above. There is a particular cruelty to winter offensives. Cold numbs your limbs and sharpens fear. Trucks froze. Radios coughed and went silent. Boots filled with sleet. Men who had fought in the heat of Sicily and Normandy found their faces stung by a new enemy. German armor punched through gaps. Road junctions that should have been secure were overrun. By December 19th, the German bulge, a crescent of advancing units, was visible on Allied maps. Commanders in London and Washington watched with alarm. One town became a symbol of resistance, Bastogne. This small Belgian crossroad sat at the heart of the bulge. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the roads that led deeper into Allied rear areas. The German plan assumed Bastogne would fall quickly. The 101st Airborne Division, however, was not scheduled for a quiet rest. They were there by chance and by will. Encircled, outnumbered, low on supplies, and with winter closing in, the paratroopers dug in and refused to surrender. When German envoys demanded their capitulation, a single one-word defiance, answered them from a colonel who refused to fold. Nuts. Encirclement does not just test arms, it tests spirit. The men in Bastogne improvised by heating ration tins on barrels, by sharing what little ammunition they had, by turning frozen fields into fields of fire. Medical personnel worked without respite. When artillery and infantry attacked, defenders held lane by lane, building by building. Their radio calls for aid were faint at first. The weather muffled them, but they persisted. In the end, their endurance drew the attention of one of the most decisive elements in the Allied response, General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton moved with a speed that became legend. He did not begin his march from triumph. He began it from a frantic race to reach the embattled center before it collapsed. In conditions that would have stalled lesser commanders, Patton turned his units east, improvised supply lines, and pushed through snow-packed roads. He did not arrive because he was invincible. He arrived because he refused to be late. That refusal mattered. When Patton's tanks punched through and linked with Bastogne's defenders, the German plan, which had assumed momentum and speed, found itself running out of map. Hitler's timetable was brutal and thinly supported. His tanks consumed fuel by the gallon. His men consumed warmth and morale. The German logistical nightmare, always present, became fatal when columns stalled on packed snow, when refueling lines were harassed by artillery, and when Allied intelligence found routes to cut. Supplies could not magically appear. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads found themselves overextended, vulnerable to counterattack, and without the air cover they desperately needed. Outside Bastogne, other narratives unfolded each hour. Small American units became anchors on which larger strategies turned. Reconnaissance patrols that reported enemy movement gave commanders time to react. Medics saved lives that, weeks later, would mean the difference between a stand and a collapse. Citizens in nearby towns fed soldiers, pointed out hidden approaches, and harbored resistance in small acts that did not make headlines but changed outcomes. War, at its clearest, is the sum of many small decisions that, together, become irrevocable. The bulge revealed the limits of German gamble-making. Hitler had bet that a cut through the Ardennes could be both rapid and decisive. Yet speed demands conditions that a failing state cannot guarantee. The German High Command misjudged American resolve and the depth of Allied resources. They also misread the political climate. They could not bargain from victory if they had not achieved the means to coerce. Instead, they found attrition, a bitter calculus that the Nazis could not win. As the weather changed, the battlefield shifted. On December 23rd, the skies finally cleared. Allied aircraft, released from the clouds, attacked with the cold precision of a force that had been waiting for its chance. P-47s and fighter bombers strafed columns, disrupted convoys, and created havoc behind German lines. Supply dumps burned, bridges were cratered. The air war did not simply add casualties. It reintroduced the Allies' decisive tool, mobility and eyes in the sky. Once the Germans lost the cover of weather, they lost the advantage that had sparked their initial success. The human toll of the Bulge was enormous. Men froze and bled and carried wounded over fields of ice. The Malmedy massacre, where American prisoners were killed after capture, revealed the brutal edge of the offensive and hardened Allied resolve. Stories of courage and cruelty circulated in equal measure. Heroism did not erase horror. But the response hardened too. American units that had been backward now moved forward with a fierce, controlled fury. They tightened the noose until the Bulge began to shrink. There is a lesson in the timeline. Offensive gambles built on hope are fragile against an adversary who can adapt. The Allied command adapted quickly. Eisenhower's staff coordinated reserves and communications. Bradley and Montgomery adjusted lines where needed. Patton executed a daring and timely flanking movement. The Allies used their superiority in material, in reserves, and in the last but decisive element, logistics. Trucks, rails, and the will to keep them moving mattered as much as tanks or rifles. By January, the tide had turned. The Bulge was progressively reduced. German units retreated in disorder or were captured. The land itself, from frozen forest to broken fields, bore witness to violence and endurance. Roads that had been arteries for German pus posed now the veins through which prisoners, ammunition, and the weary walked back to Allied hands. The war did not end in the Ardennes, but Hitler's last major offensive in the West had failed. The Wehrmacht had exhausted irreplaceable resources and morale. The Allies, having held, were now in a position to push east. The strategic initiative shifted against Germany in a way that could not be reversed. The narrative of the Bulge must be told in human terms because statistics flatten the reality. Yes, thousands were killed and wounded on both sides. Yes, tanks were lost and cities scarred. But the story that holds an audience is the one of men who, under cold sky and miscalculated risk, chose to stand. It is the courier who crossed frozen fields with a message that rerouted a division. It is the sergeant who held his rifle until reinforcements arrived. It is the nurse who warmed the wounded with fear in her eyes. Those decisions, small and immediate, created the larger arc of history. For a patriotic American audience, the Bulge resonates because it is a story of resolve. It is a story of citizens and soldiers who, when surprised, when tested, answered with endurance rather than collapse. The moral weight is not triumphal. It is steady. They did not win because they believed they were infallible, but because they refused to be overcome. In that refusal, there is a message. National strength is both a machine of industry and an ethical muscle of will. When you tell this story to listeners who expect drama, you must deliver micro-reveals that keep attention. Every 3 minutes, land a detail that rewires expectations, a message intercepted that changes a plan, a civilian who becomes a scout, a tank that breaks down but becomes a barricade, the sound of a bell that calls volunteers to dig foxholes, an officer who refuses to retreat and finds his men rallied rather than routed. Those are the moments that make a long narrative feel necessary. They are the hooks that keep ears focused. If you ask what turned the Bulge, you cannot point to a single act. You point to a chain: German miscalculation, winter weather that both helped and hurt the attackers, American courage in places like Bastogne, Patton's timely maneuver, the clearing of skies and unleashing of Allied air power, and the grinding arithmetic of logistics. Each link mattered. Break any one, and the outcome could have been different. Taken together, they illustrate a larger truth about war. Strategy must be matched by supply, by timing, and by the simple human willingness to keep fighting when the map looks bleak. In telling this script, do not sentimentalize the suffering. Let the facts stand. Homes shelled, towns burned, families displaced. At the same time, frame those facts with meaning. The Bulge was Hitler's last major offensive in the West because it exhausted what Germany had left to gamble with. It did not fail from nowhere. It failed because the Allies adapted, because soldiers refused to give ground, and because the industrial capacity and resolve of the United States and its partners could be marshaled in time. That combination, human courage plus industrial might, is a compelling, patriotic narrative. It shows not only bravery, but competence. In the final account, the Ardennes campaign is a lesson in limits. Overreach is a mortal flaw. When leaders gamble all, they risk everything. Hitler's gamble cost Germany not merely men and steel, but momentum and opportunity. The failure at the Bulge accelerated the Allied drive into Germany. It hastened the end of the European war. For the Americans who wore the uniform, for the citizens who supported the war effort at home, and for the families who waited by radios, the Bulge remains a moment of national character. Remember the small images that linger: snow whitening a ruined churchyard, a Sherman tank's tread frozen in place, a handwritten note smuggled through a line of trucks crawling through a moonlit forest. Remember also the louder ones: the roar of counterattacks, the crack of artillery, the whistle of strafing planes. Let the narration move from wide to narrow, from strategy to sergeant, from maps to faces. That is how an audience of Americans age 35 plus will stay. They will listen for the facts and stay for the people. End with a clear, steady summation. Hitler bet the house on a single move and lost not because his soldiers lacked skill, but because the Allies did not collapse. In the cold of the Ardennes, American men and women held lines, improvised rescue, and returned initiative to the Allied cause. The last great German gamble had failed, and in that failure lay the end of the Reich's hopes in the West.